Good afternoon. I want to thank you for joining us again on our study of Isaiah. If you will, please be turning to chapter 9 as we're going to look at another powerful prophecy of the Messiah in this context. But before we do that, I want us to step back just a little bit. Last time we looked at chapter 8. And if you'll remember in chapter 8, there was a banner that was to signify a message. And basically it went something like this. Swift, how was that? Excuse me here. Swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. And basically it was a restatement. Again, remember in Hebrew, repetition is very important. So it was saying the same thing twice. It's talking about difficulty that's coming. And Isaiah's son was given the name that was on that banner in chapter 8, Maher Shalal Hashbaz. Maher Halal Shashbaz are the two phrases that are there. And so every time that name is used, it has to do with the instruction that God provided regarding what's going to happen to Israel and to Syria because of what they tried to get Ahaz to do in joining their alliance against Tiglath-Pileser III. So I want to go back. Brother Don Shackelford, in his commentary on Isaiah, has an application section at the end of each chapter. And he refers to this being a sermonic name in this verse. And that's verses 1 through 4 of chapter 8. Let's read that again, and then just look at a few things, and then we'll move into that powerful prophecy in chapter 9. Moreover, the Lord said to me, take a large scroll and write on it with a man's pen concerning Maher Shalal Hashbaz. And I will take for myself faithful witnesses to record Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. Then I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said to me, call his name Maher Shalal Hashbaz. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my mother, or my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be taken away before the king of Assyria. So you're looking at a name that was symbolic of God's actions through Assyria as it relates to what's going to happen to Israel and Syria in the context of what we've been looking at here for several chapters regarding the conflict with Judah and with Ahaz. It was a name that was a sermonic name, and what is meant by that is every time that name was proclaimed, every time that name was spoken, then it was a sermon as to what is going to happen to Israel and to Syria. Well, what can we learn about that name that spoke of the destruction of these two nations? 3 lessons I think we can learn, and we'll do this in just a couple of minutes. Number 1, we are reminded about God's truthfulness. The prophecy was immediately fulfilled, and God's integrity was revealed there. Remember that 2 witnesses confirmed the prophecy as well as its fulfillment. Secondly, we're reminded of God's hatred for sin. God did not stand with these 2 nations. Now, again, let's go back. When it was one nation, when you had a unified kingdom, God was with them as he promised Joshua that he would be. And as long as they stayed faithful, then God did fight for them, and God cared for them and provided for them. Well, now with the dividing of the nations, the 10 northern tribes of Israel had gone way off into idolatry because of the temples being erected at Dan and Bethel with calf worship that was established in those places. And then that just continued to snowball until God used Assyria, Sargon II at that time, 722 BC, to bring them into captivity. Judah was going to suffer the same consequence. That's why Isaiah was warning them here. And they did not heed his warning. They didn't heed Jeremiah's warning. And by 606 BC, they began to be carried off into Babylonian captivity. Well, God was not going to stand with Israel. He was not going to stand with Syria because of their alliance against Tiglath-Pileser III. They chose to go their own way rather than following the guidance that God provided for them. We need to understand a lesson and application for today as God is always going to oppose sin. No matter what goes on in our society, no matter how vile our society gets, God will stand with us as long as we stand with Him, seek guidance from Him, maintain our relationship with Him. Why should God bless a nation that is steeped in sin? Someone has well said, God bless America. Why should He? In the direction that we're going. And if we continue down that slippery slope of sin as a society, people cannot expect God to stand with them during that time. Regardless of who may support it, God will always oppose sin. Number 3, and then we'll move on. We're reminded of the place of teaching in God's plan. Every time that name was uttered, Mayor Shalal Hashbaz, a lesson was being taught. A sermon was being preached. The purpose of giving that name was to keep his message in front of his people for the prescribed time that was being addressed, for that period of time. Even when people were rejecting him, God used that opportunity to teach. When you see the prophets, the 4 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, when you look at the 12 minor prophets, more often than not, those are sent to God's people in a time of difficulty, when difficult, hard lessons need to be taught. But especially in that time, God could just simply stand back and watch how things run their course. He's given His will. He's told them about the blessings. He's told them about consequences as it relates to whether or not people obey God's will. And if He was a God as the deists hold that He was, a deist believes that God exists, but that He's not involved. He doesn't interact with people. I don't serve a God like that. God does continue to interact. Now He does it through human means today. But in the day that we're looking at, in the first century as the apostles were sent, we're looking at people that God directed to go to His people because God was still communicating through all of that. That manifests in a major way God's care for man. If He didn't care, why would He bother to continue talking to them? We also need to understand that God does not violate the free moral agency with which we were created. All of men are created with the ability to choose, the right to choose. But we're not going to be made to do anything in that sense. As we're free moral agents, God is going to allow us to choose which way we want to go. If we want to depart from Him, He's going to allow that to happen. We're just going to have to suffer the consequences of our choices. But God desires that we choose to follow Him and to seek His will and His way. That's what was going on here. Judah is going to be punished. Judah is going to face the harsh consequences that God had laid out for them because of their sin. He doesn't want it to happen, but His justice is going to require that it happens. But through all of that, He's still, you've got the option of Israel and Syria in alliance with them. Remember, Ahaz rejected that. But then you had the alliance of Ahaz with Assyria in deciding to go ahead and submit himself to them and to pay tribute. God allowed that. But what God wanted was for Ahaz to seek Him and His will. Remember again in chapter 7, Isaiah told him to ask for a sign. He refused to do so. A sign was given. God still communicated. Ahaz, I have not changed my mind regarding the Davidic promise. But he's not going to keep us from choosing the bad way. So, okay, now let's step into chapter 9 and let's look at a powerful, powerful prophecy. The appearance of Emmanuel. Now remember, in chapters 7 through chapter 12, it's called the book of Emmanuel. Emmanuel is going to be seen over and over again here. But here we see a great, powerful, messianic prophecy that is uttered in this day. Let's read verses 1 through 7 and then look at that in our course of study. Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan in Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you have broken the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle and garments rolled in blood will be used for burning and fuel of fire. And here we go. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Verses 6 and 7, such a powerful lesson. Chapter 8 closed with a message of distress and gloom. Remember, we're talking about kind of a roller coaster ride through the book of Isaiah. You've got at times when it sinks way down into the depths of captivity and bondage and burdens and punishment. And then you see a high spot where he talks about the remnant or some sense of hope, or quite often messianic prophecies that are delivered in these times. Chapter 8 closes with doom and gloom. Chapter 9 opens with the dawning of a new day. The promise that not everything is bad as it relates to these things. This is a forecast of the coming Messiah. Again, remember, back in chapter 7, he's depicted as Emmanuel. Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, again, shows that to be a messianic prophecy that's going to come through. Now, there are those who deny this is messianic, but they're few, and the arguments come very late as that goes. Well, verses 1 and 2, Zebulun and Naphtali were given tribal territories north of Mount Carmel. Now, a good way to remember where Mount Carmel is I want you to imagine holding your hand like this. Let me show you this way with a thumb. I want you to imagine this being the Mediterranean coastline. And there's a little piece of land that sticks out like a thumb way on up there to the northeastern portion of the Mediterranean Sea. And on that thumb is where you're going to see Mount Carmel. Remember, that's where Elijah had that great conflict with the prophets of Baal regarding calling their God to light the bonfire that was set up. Well, Zebulun and Naphtali were given territories just north of there and then just west of the Sea of Galilee. And at that time, these areas contained a mixed population that caused them to be designated as Galilee of the Gentiles. Nazareth was in that testimony during New Testament times. But a new idea of Gentile involvement in the time of hope is probably what is being addressed here. I find it interesting that though God pulled the Jews aside on Mount Sinai and gave them the law of Moses and then focuses on them throughout the rest of Old Testament history, because that's the line through which Christ is going to come, he never forgets the Gentiles. You've got the book of Jonah. You've got the book of Nahum. You've got references such as this to see Gentiles are still in God's mind. Remember that the promise made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, was that through his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. How sad in the time of the first century that they had allowed the Pharisees and their tradition to twist things so that the Jews saw themselves as that seed promise. Remember in the book of Galatians that Paul had to correct them by saying seed as of one and not seeds as of many. He had to show that it was messianic. Now, as we move into the New Testament, you move into the book of Acts, you see that they begin in Jerusalem. But then if you look at Acts chapter 1, verse 8, you see that spiral. It began in Jerusalem, and then it spiraled out, and then by the time we get to chapter 10, we see Peter being taught a lesson with the sheet being suspended, seeing the clean and unclean in it, that we see the conversion of Cornelius, that in an official way kicks in the concept of Gentile inclusion in the proclamation of the gospel. The phrase walked and lived are in the present tense in Hebrew in verses 1 and 2. They're in the perfect tense, not the present tense. The perfect tense is the tense of completed action, but it's in the future. We call it the prophetic perfect, and I've referred to it that way in several classes. In other words, he's speaking of something as having already occurred, though it's still in the future. This walking and living is not happening now. It's going to happen later as it relates to the context. It had not occurred as yet, but the certainty of it was so strong that it's recorded as if it had already occurred. I'm just going to mention something here. I'm not going to take the time to do that here, but on your own, flip ahead to chapter 53. There's that great promise, that great lesson as to the crucifixion of Christ. He was bruised for our iniquities. He was chastised for our sins. Remember, that's past tense, but that's way in the future. About 800 years in the future. Yet it's spoken of as if it had already happened. The Hebrew language had a tense, the perfect tense, that taught that lesson, and it provided certainty and assurance and confidence that all these things were going to happen. Then he says, upon them a light has shined. In John's prologue, John chapter 1, specifically in verse 9, Jesus was proclaimed to be that true light. In John chapter 8 and verse 12, remember there the words Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And I do not believe that it's just happy coincidence that those things are being addressed here. We're looking at something that is messianic in nature. And we can see so many things tied to that. E.J. Young in his commentary said this, the whole work of Christ and all the blessings which he brings may be characterized by one word, light. Notice how we see good and evil being portrayed as light and darkness. What is darkness? It's the absence of light. What does light do? It dispels the darkness. We see Jesus being described as that light that pushes the darkness away if people will but follow him. We move into verse 3, and this verse shows the result that's issuing from the light mentioned in verse 2. Let's look at that again. You have multiplied the nation and increased its joy. They rejoice before you according to the joy of harvest, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. Remember back in chapter 5 in that parable of the vineyard? You're looking at a vine owner, a vineyard owner that had done everything he could do to bring a promised harvest. And when harvest got there, it was sour grapes. There was nothing he could have done to make it be any better. And of course, the lesson taught there is God has done everything for these people that he could do. Even sending another prophet to come their way. Jeremiah is going to come their way as well. But still, the result is not what God intended, because it did not fit according to God's will as it related to his covenant. Gladness and rejoicing were going to be things that will be seen in a beautiful harvest or in a victory against one's enemies. What is going to bring about that beautiful harvest? What is going to bring a sense of rejoicing? It's going to be Christ coming into the world to deal with man's problem of sin. Verses 4 and 5. Commentators indicate that there may be two historical references here. The first recalls Egyptian bondage, and that's reflected in the words yoke, burden, shoulder, and oppressor. The other may refer to the defeat of Midian, and that's recorded in Judges chapter 6 through 8. Part of the problem, and I was discussing this with somebody at school the other day, part of the problem is, as we look at commentaries dealing with this time, we don't have a lot of historical pegs to make sure we understand what's being spoken of at a given time. And so at best, we can say, I think it refers to this time frame as far as fulfillment. Now, at other times, we do have those historical pegs. We can know what's being spoken of and when it occurred. But I don't know that we can nail down these two events that he's talking about here in these two verses. As a matter of fact, it doesn't do any harm to the context. As I've indicated before, we need to be big picture thinkers. We don't need to put our nose against a canvas and try to focus on every little brush stroke, because that can be frustrating in our study. That's not what was intended. A major, powerful lesson was being taught. Messiah is coming. And it's going to be a time of greatness. Verse 6, the importance of the word child in that verse is seen in the fact that in the Hebrew language, it's the first word of a sentence. When you look at Hebrew rhetoric, there's a lot of different ways that lessons were taught. I've talked about chiasms in the past, and you're looking at lessons that form kind of a V laying on its side with points leading up and points leading away. You're also looking at poetry, Hebrew poetry. You've got lines that agreed with each other, lines where the second line completed the first line, or lines that stood in antithesis to one another. All of that had to do with parallelism, and all of those were effective ways to teach in the Hebrew language. Well, remember that repetition was key. Isaiah chapter 6, holy, holy, holy. That's the way to say holiest. That's how we would say it today. But at that point, they just reiterated, they repeated the words to show emphasis. Well, here you have another Hebrew rhetorical device that puts the important word as the first word of a sentence. And that's what occurs here. Here he's described as a ruler from the line of David. Now remember, that ties us back to chapter 7 and verse 14. This one who was to come, this child that was going to be born to a virgin, was in the Davidic line, and God was sending a message to to Ahaz, saying, you're in the Davidic line, stand up and be confident. But he didn't do so. The language used indicates, however, that he would be seen in a different way than those naturally coming from David's line. Now, we've mentioned this in the past, but let's nail this down again. When you look at the 10 northern tribes of Israel, there were 9 different dynasties of kings. In other words, 9 different families that ruled. Certain descendants would go down through, and then you would have a dynasty shift, and then several of his descendants would rule. That occurred 9 times in the 10 northern tribes of Israel. But in the 2 southern tribes of Judah, there was one line. It was David. Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. 2 Samuel chapter 7, God's going to keep that line pure. That's a lesson that was given to David. That's another lesson here. It's a lesson that Ahaz should have learned in chapter 7, verse 14. And it's reiterated here to show that something a little bit different is going to happen. As a matter of fact, we're going to see that it's a lot different. The nature of the kingdom itself was entirely different. It was never intended for God to literally sit on David's throne, for Jesus to literally sit on his throne. It was a spiritual reign. It's the church that's being spoken of. It dealt with authority. It dealt with ownership. It dealt with sovereignty. All of those things were key. This again is a problem that I have with what many believe in premillennialism today, where they indicate that at some time yet in the future, Christ is going to come back and he's going to sit on David's throne for 1,000 literal years. It's never the way it was intended to be. As a matter of fact, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, or my people would fight. It was never intended to be that. But even the disciples never fully understood that, at least until the time that Jesus resurrected or ascended. Because there in Acts chapter 1, they basically asked the question, will you at this time restore the kingdom? They had been taught for so long, well over 400 years. It was twisted that Christ was going to sit on that throne. That's not the point at all. And that's what's being seen in this context. The word wonderful is often used in the Old Testament to describe those things associated with God that are supernatural and extraordinary. Now, this might be a good point, a good time also to make this point. We've got about 3 minutes for our time today. Depending upon what version you use, the commas are in different places. One of my students this morning called to quote. This was the memory work for that week, was Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. And where the New King James says wonderful, comma, counselor, comma, that's 2 words. But the New American Standard translates it as wonderful counselor. It puts it together in one thought. Doesn't do any harm here again, but it's giving you different ideas on things that are based probably largely on different manuscripts. The New King James and the New American Standard are based on 2 completely different manuscripts there. But I'm going to follow the New King James model. He's called wonderful. He's called counselor. He's called mighty God. He's called everlasting Father. He's called Prince of Peace. There in verse 6. Mighty God points to his divinity. That's exactly John's point. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He's called everlasting Father. Young indicated that the quality of fatherhood is defined by the word everlasting or eternal. In the Old Testament, God is called Father 8 times, and he's compared to a father in 7 additional verses. But the fatherhood of God is a message that is much more prevalent in the New Testament, particularly in the words of Jesus. He's called Prince of Peace. Walter Kaiser indicated that the word peace is more than usually thought. It comes from a Hebrew word that the root meaning was the word whole. And so therefore peace speaks of wholeness and soundness and health and well-being. Someone has well said that peace is not the absence of trouble, but it's the presence of God even when we have trouble. Oh, powerful, powerful thoughts. So therefore, we can have peace. We should have peace, even in times of adversity. Remember the number of times that the Israelites complained in the Exodus over and over? They had no peace in their life because they weren't allowing God to come through in their thinking. But then let's close just a few seconds looking at verse 7. And Lord willing, next time we'll pick up in chapter 8, going back again to a dark message. According to the prophecy, there would be no end to his reign. The emphasis upon the never-ending nature of his reign makes it clear that Isaiah is not talking about another human king here. They're going to rise and fall. Christ is going to be the last king as it relates to the New Testament church. At one point, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when everything is done, then Christ is going to turn the kingdom back over to God, and he's going to place himself in submission with us. Look about 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 28, 29, somewhere in that context for that idea. He was referring to the final king. In Matthew's gospel account, this is associated with the earthly ministry of Jesus. Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 17, which followed his temptation. I want to thank you again for your joining us for this study. I'm hoping that I'm whetting your appetite for more study here. There's some powerful lessons. We're going to move through passages sometimes more quickly. Sometimes we're going to slow down as it related to this one because they're so key. But until next time, God bless you.